Picture yourself rattling along in a covered wagon, wind whipping your face, the prairie stretching endlessly ahead, destiny whispering from the horizon. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Wrong. What you really signed up for was months of filth, dysentery, and disappointment in a wooden box on wheels that could double as your coffin at any moment. Forget the Hollywood scenes of wagons glowing in the sunset. The truth was mud up to your knees, oxen that flat out ignored you, and neighbors ready to pull a trigger because you snored too loud the night before. So, let's dive into why traveling in a covered wagon was less a grand adventure and more survival of the fittest. The terrain wanted you dead. The so-called Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Mormon Trail weren't really trails at all. Maps promised pathways west, but what you got was a vague set of wagon ruts that disappeared the moment it rained, snowed, or when the wind decided to erase them. Every type of landscape came with its own special brand of torture. The Great Plains looked endless and flat, until a thunderstorm rolled in and turned the ground into axle-deep mud that swallowed wagons whole. The Rocky Mountains? Beautiful from a distance. Up close, they were a nightmare of steep passes and narrow ledges, where one bad ox step could send half your family cartwheeling into a ravine. The deserts offered the opposite problem. No mud, just blazing heat, sandstorms, and mirages that tricked you into chasing lakes that didn't exist. And then there were the rivers. Some looked calm until they flipped your wagon like a toy boat, scattering flour barrels and children downstream. Others were so wide, settlers had to waste weeks detouring around them. The forests in the Pacific Northwest weren't kinder either. Progress slowed to a crawl as trees were hacked down one at a time just to clear a few yards of path. Travelers often had to dismantle their wagons, lower them down cliffs with ropes, and rebuild them at the bottom, ideally without anyone breaking a leg or going into labor mid-descent. Because yes, babies had a knack for arriving at the worst possible moments. The terrain didn't just resist you, it despised you. Every mile west was earned with sweat, curses, and the sinking suspicion that the ground itself wanted to make you its next grave marker. Wagons were wooden nightmares. On paper, the covered wagon was the ultimate frontier SUV. In reality, it was a rolling box of splinters designed to break your spirit before you even left Missouri. The so-called prairie schooner looked sturdy enough in paintings, but the wood was so dry and brittle it cracked if you glared at it too hard. These things were held together by pegs, rope, and blind optimism. Every bump on the trail, so basically the entire trail, threatened to snap a wheel or split an axle. Families packed spare parts, but they were about as useful as carrying a second umbrella into a hurricane. When something broke, and it always did, there was no wagon repair shop waiting around the bend. You became the mechanic, carpenter, and blacksmith all in one, armed with little more than a pocket knife and a bad attitude. Replacement spokes had to be whittled from tree branches, bolts hammered together from scraps. The whole wagon jacked up with rocks and rope, while half a ton of supplies sat glaring at you. And you did all this while swatting mosquitoes the size of walnuts, running low on food, and watching your oxen chew through whatever leather straps weren't nailed down. If the wagon finally gave up in the middle of nowhere, you unloaded your life onto the ground, sat on a barrel of flour, and reconsidered every decision that brought you here. Many families never even made it past the first few hundred miles. Their wagons simply collapsed under the weight of too much baggage and too little oak. Out west, your wagon wasn't your ticket to freedom. It was a wooden coffin on wheels, and the nails were already loose. Every meal was a gamble. Food on the trail was less mealtime and more slow starvation with extra steps. Families packed barrels of flour, dried beans, bacon, coffee, and the occasional slab of hardtack so dense it could double as a weapon. Variety was a myth. By week 3, even the beans were judging you. Cooking was its own ordeal. Firewood was scarce on the plains, so settlers burned dried buffalo chips. Yes, literal animal droppings, to boil water or fry bacon. Rain turned campfires into mud puddles. Wind scattered sparks across the prairie. And by the time your beans were lukewarm, a dust storm might season them for you. If the weather didn't ruin dinner, the flies and mosquitoes took over, feasting on you while you tried to feast on them. And the food itself? It spoiled fast. Meat went rancid in the heat. Flour molded in damp weather, and bacon turned into a science experiment long before you reached Idaho. With no refrigeration, everything was a gamble between eating it now or regretting it later, sometimes both. Diaries from the trails mention stomach cramps, vomiting, or entire wagon trains knocked flat after sharing a suspicious stew. Hunger wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Without enough calories, people collapsed from exhaustion, and children wasted away. Even the oxen sometimes ended up on the menu when supplies ran out. Out west, dinner was never about taste. It was about survival, and survival tasted a lot like burnt beans and regret. Surprise! It's disease o'clock. If the wagon didn't crush you and the food didn't poison you, the trail had one more trick: disease. The westward journey was basically a 6-month-long immune system demolition derby. The single most common word carved into gravestones along the Oregon Trail wasn't hero, it was cholera. Water was the main culprit. You either drank from rivers where animals rotted upstream, or from shallow wells that doubled as toilets every time it rained. Boiling water was smart, but firewood was too precious to waste on playing Tea Party. So people gambled, and usually lost. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and measles spread faster than gossip in a frontier saloon. One sip of so-called refreshing spring water, and suddenly you were doubled over, leaking from both ends, while flies treated your forehead like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Doctors? Forget it. Most wagon trains didn't have one. And if they did, chances were high he believed mercury cured rashes and bloodletting fixed fevers. Remedies included mustard plasters, laudanum, and amputation, sometimes all in the same week. Even minor wounds turned deadly. A blister rubbed raw could fester into infection. A nail scratch might summon tetanus. The brutal truth was that sickness wasn't the exception. It was the expectation. Every wagon carried not just people and supplies, but the unspoken knowledge that someone inside would be buried along the way. Out here, the question wasn't if you'd get sick. It was whether you'd survive long enough to dig the grave. Birth, death, and everything in between. Childbirth on the trail was brutal. There were no hospitals, no sterile instruments, and pain relief came in the form of whiskey, if you were lucky. Women gave birth in wagons bouncing over rutted trails, in fields during thunderstorms, or simply on the side of the road while oxen chewed nearby. And then, almost unbelievably, many of them got right back on their feet, walking alongside the wagon with a newborn bundled in whatever scrap of cloth was available. But survival was never guaranteed. Infant mortality was crushingly high. Mothers often died from infection, blood loss, or complications no one could treat. Families buried children along the roadside with nothing more than a wooden cross, sometimes moving on just minutes later because the train couldn't stop for grief. Death wasn't limited to childbirth. Misfires from rifles, wagon wheels crushing children, drowning at river crossings, being kicked by livestock. Accidents were everywhere. Even a small burn from a campfire could turn fatal if infection set in. And yet, people pressed forward. Every mile gained was a victory. Every nightfall with the family still intact was a small miracle. The trails weren't just about reaching your goal. They were about surviving the constant collision of life and death, often on the very same day. River crossings were death traps. The trails had many obstacles, but rivers were the true lottery of doom. From a distance, they looked like glittering ribbons of fresh water, Up close, they were giant death traps, waiting to flip wagons, drown oxen, and sweep families downstream like driftwood. Settlers had no bridges, no ferries, at least not most of the time. Crossing meant driving your wagon straight into the current and praying it didn't tip. Some rivers were calm on the surface, but hid strong undertows that yanked people under in seconds. Others were wide enough to force weeks-long detours just to find a shallow spot. Even so-called safe crossings weren't safe. A loose wheel or a panicked mule could turn the whole event into tragedy before breakfast. Supplies often didn't survive the plunge. Flour barrels dissolved into paste, rifles rusted, and precious keepsakes vanished downstream. Families arrived on the far bank wet, shivering, and lighter by half their belongings, if they arrived at all. Diaries from the trail are filled with stories of wagons overturning midstream, children slipping from their parents' arms, or animals dragged under by the weight of the harness. And it wasn't just drowning. Soaked clothing led to hypothermia, even in summer nights that turned unexpectedly cold. Riverbanks were muddy traps where wagons sank to the axles, forcing hours of backbreaking labor just to haul them out. Every crossing was a gamble, and the house always won. Out west, rivers didn't quench your thirst. They tested your will to live. Neighbors could kill you. 2. You might think the biggest danger came from the wilderness, but sometimes it was the people walking right beside you. Life on the trail crammed families together for months, with no privacy, little sleep, and every nerve rubbed raw. That was a recipe for fistfights, and sometimes gunfights. Disputes broke out over everything: grazing rights, borrowed tools, noisy children, or who ate the last piece of bacon. One man's mule stepping on another man's foot could escalate into a shouting match, and shouting matches weren't always settled peacefully. With no sheriff within hundreds of miles, justice was whatever the angriest settler decided it should be. Alcohol didn't help. Some wagon trains carried liquor, and drunk tempers boiled over fast. Add hunger, exhaustion, and the stress of constant danger, and neighbors who once shared supplies might suddenly be pointing rifles at each other. There are accounts of travelers being expelled from wagon trains after fights turned ugly, which often meant a slow death alone on the trail. Even within families, tensions flared. Husbands and wives clashed over directions, over work, or just the crushing fatigue of endless marching. Children paid the price for mistakes, sometimes harshly, sometimes fatally. The wagon train was supposed to symbolize unity, but in practice, it was a simmering cauldron of human frustration. The wilderness was cruel, but at least it was predictable. People were unpredictable. And on the trail, your worst enemy might be sleeping in the wagon next to yours. Bandits, bullets, and bad vibes. As if rattlesnakes, busted wagons, and dysentery weren't enough, the trail also came with the occasional threat of human violence. Out west, there was no police station around the corner, no cavalry on speed dial. If trouble showed up, you either handled it yourself, or you didn't handle it at all. Bandits were a real problem, especially for smaller or slower wagon groups. To an outlaw, a wagon train wasn't a cluster of families. It was a rolling general store. Food, livestock, tools, even boots were fair game. Some bandits staged nighttime raids. Others posed as friendly travelers until it was too late. A desperate man with nothing to lose was often more dangerous than a pack of wolves. And then there was the constant paranoia about Native American attacks. Contrary to dime novels and Hollywood epics, most indigenous groups didn't spend their days plotting ambushes. Many traded food, horses, or guidance to struggling settlers. Violence, when it happened, usually had a cause: broken treaties, stolen resources, or trespassing on sacred lands. Still, the fear was always there. Children learned to load rifles before they could read, and wagon trains set up night watches, jumping at every rustling bush. But danger wasn't just out there. Sometimes it came from within. Rivalries between settlers, Drunk disputes, or simple desperation could turn deadly. Out on the trail, every gun was loaded, and every argument had the potential to end with a bullet. The truth was simple: the wilderness didn't care if you lived or died, and neither did the people lurking in the shadows. Out west, trust was a luxury few could afford. Weather was your worst enemy. The frontier didn't need bandits or wild animals to ruin your day. The sky alone could handle that just fine. Weather out west wasn't a background detail. It was the main villain. One moment you were trudging under a cloudless sky. The next, you were drowning in a thunderstorm that turned the trail into a river of mud. Heat on the plains cooked travelers alive. Shade was non-existent, and water vanished faster than patience. Sunburn and heat stroke knocked people flat before noon, leaving them too weak to keep pace. Then came the storms. Lightning split the sky, prairie winds flipped wagons, and hail the size of walnuts pelted anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the open. Winter wasn't kinder. Snow buried wagon tracks until settlers wandered in circles. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze livestock overnight. Hypothermia crept in quietly, especially when wet clothes from a failed river crossing froze stiff against the skin. And in the deserts, cold nights chilled travelers to the bone just hours after they had been scorched by the sun. Tornadoes? Yes, those too. Entire wagon trains scattered when a funnel cloud touched down, leaving splintered wood and supplies strewn across the prairie. Sandstorms in the west blinded travelers for days, filling eyes, lungs, and every crevice of the wagon with grit. The weather wasn't just unpredictable. It was relentless. Out here, the sky itself was trying to kill you, and it didn't care how many miles you had left to go. New land, same hell. After months of mud, cholera, and hauling wagons across rivers that wanted you dead, you'd think the finish line came with warm beds and pies cooling on windowsills. It didn't. What you actually won at the end of the trail was dirt. Endless, unbroken, back-breaking dirt. There were no houses waiting, no barns, no wells, not even a fence post. Just a patch of land you now had to tame from scratch with the same blistered hands that barely survived the journey. Shelter meant cutting down trees or stacking sod into walls, hoping the whole thing didn't collapse the first time the wind sneezed. Wells had to be dug by hand, crops planted in soil that wasn't feeling generous, and livestock fenced in before the neighbors' hungry cows helped themselves. And don't expect community. Your nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away. That meant no doctor when you got sick, no teacher for your kids, and no preacher unless one wandered through by mule. Winters trapped families inside half-finished cabins with dwindling food, while summer brought droughts, locust plagues, and debts piling up from supplies bought on credit. Worst of all, the land wasn't empty. It had been home to native peoples for centuries, but settlers arrived with land deeds and rifles, backed by government policy that erased what came before. The so-called New Start came at someone else's cost, and conflict was never far behind. So what was the grand reward for surviving the trail? A patch of soil, years of back-breaking labor, and a permanent 1,000-yard stare. The wagon train didn't deliver you to paradise. It just dropped you off at the next level of punishment.